All
Happy
right.
rings, everybody. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
We should start with that.
I see attendees are starting to populate. Gonna just wait a couple minutes to let people get logged in.
Yeah, it's New Orleans time. Let's wait a minute or two.
Got 42, 44, 46, yay.
All right.
All right. We should have a poll. I think we're going to have 107.
Yeah, people are.
I'll bid 108.
All right. I'm keeping track.
We
I'll
got
say 114.
63 right now.
Yeah.
Michael, you said 114?
Yes.
Okay. Mark, you want some of this?
No, it is what it
Valda?
is.
I'm
Valda?
good. I am good.
Jim?
Tucker Mendoza to everyone here.
Come on,
Hello.
Jim.
Let's
Hi,
see.
Tucker.
70.
70? No. What's your number?
66 right now.
Oh, I got 66 people right now.
I know, but what's your bet?
Hey, Harry.
All right.
I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We're recording, so anybody who's late will be to watch the whole thing from the start. So hello, everybody. My name's Jim Meadows. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the executive director of SAGE New Orleans, formerly known as No Age, and I also serve as the secretary on the board of directors for the LGBT plus Archives Project of Louisiana. I'm really excited about the program we have for you tonight. And before we get started with Frank Perez's, we're going to look at a little footage from a show called Just for the Record. It was a cable access show that broadcast in New Orleans in the late 80s and early 90s. It was produced by one of our panelists, Valda Lewis. And it's this clip is 3 minutes, and it'll give you kind of a sense of what Pride in New Orleans looked like in the late 80s and early 90s. So Valda, I'm gonna let you go ahead and share your screen so folks can see
There
that.
we go.
Let's hope it works.
And here we go.
This is a revelry I remember from 11 years ago. Hello, Charlene. I want you to tell me how this all started and how far we've gone from 11 years ago.
Well, we've gone from one portalette to 10. 11 years ago, the gay community, specifically through the Pink Triangle Alliance, thought that New Orleans should have a gay fest. Mr. O'Brien was able to get our permits, and with the wonderful cooperation of Dutch Morial, who allowed us to have our first gay fest, that's when it started. And of course, that year it was Dick O'Connor was the co-director, and Mark Gonzalez and I. And it's been a very difficult time, but we found that it's getting better every year.
The crowds are getting bigger, the entertainment's a lot better, and politically, we're getting more and more political people here to speak.
I think anytime you see those many politicians there, that there's a reason. It's a positive image that the community is making. And I think what we've shown through the years with our networking is that we really are family, that we work very hard to make this a successful function.
Thank you, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Well, thank you, Lo. Happy Gay Pride.
Happy Gay Pride.
What a difference a day makes. 24 little hours. Brought the sun and the flowers where there used to be rain. My yesterday was blue, dear. Now I'm far from you, dear. My lonely nights are too dear since you said you were mine. What a difference a day makes. There's a rainbow before me. Skies above won't be stormy. Since that moment of bliss, that thrilling kisses have come when you find romance on your menu. What a difference a day makes. And the difference is you. Everybody way down yonder in New Orleans. Yeah, that's the land of dreams. You got a garden of Eden, and that's what I mean. We got 3 old babies flashing they might be guys. Stop. Hey, Dean, give your lady fair a smile. And bet your life gonna wanna stay there and Dixie a while. Yeah, we got help right here on earth with all of the beautiful things way down in New Orleans. Back way down there in New Orleans.
Let me take the opportunity to commend you on this efforts for today's activity and want to encourage you to hang in there. The struggle still exists. If it's worth having, it's worth fighting for.
And
All
there you
right.
go.
Thank you for that, Valda.
Thanks, Valdo.
Great
Thank you
video.
so much. Before we move on to the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Frank Perez. Frank is a local writer and historian and has served as the president of the LGBT plus Archives Project of Louisiana. He's the author of In Exile, The History and Lore Surrounding New Orleans' Gay Culture and Its Oldest Gay Bar. And he's currently writing a biography of New Orleans LGBT activist Stuart Butler. Frank, what can you tell us about the history of Pride in New Orleans?
Hi, Jim. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I think we all know that Pride originated with Stonewall, and what we may not know is that 5 months after Stonewall happened, there was a conference in Philadelphia of homophile organizations. It was a regional, Eastern Regional Conference. And some of the attendees there had been at Stonewall. This was the Gay Liberation Front, which was a break off of the Mattachine Society. And the Gay Liberation Front had subgroups. There was a group of lesbian activists called the Lavender Menace. And Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson, who are so often associated with Pride, had formed an organization called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. This is 1970, okay, so the language is dated. But it was at that conference in Philadelphia in 1969 that they passed a resolution to commemorate the Stonewall riots with a parade, or a march is what they called it. And so the Gay Liberation Front was at the heart of that. And in New Orleans, we had a very short-lived chapter of the Gay Liberation Front. They didn't really do a march or parade. They did do some protest of police brutality. They had a gay inn at City Park. But that's, if we really want to go all the way back, that's kind of where you have to start. But it was a few years later, in 1978, that the first Gay Pride rally took place. Not a parade, not a march, not a festival, just a rally. And this rally was produced by a group called the Pink Triangle Alliance. And the Pink Triangle Alliance was the public face of another group called the Louisiana Sissies in Struggle, who had come out of the Mulberry House Collective in Fayetteville, Arkansas a few years earlier. They not only worked on behalf of queer rights, but also on racial issues, issues of socioeconomic inequality and so forth and so on. And so the Pink Triangle Alliance had the first Gay Pride rally in 1978. And it wasn't too terribly long after that rally that the Pink Triangle Alliance attended a meeting with some other community leaders, including Charlene, who we saw in the video, Dick O'Connor, who was referenced, Mark Gonzalez, one of our panelists. And it was a meeting to discuss what would happen the following year. And Mark will talk more about this later, I suppose, but in a nutshell, they decided they needed to do a festival. They needed to do a little bit more than just a rally. And so that's how Gay Fest was born in 1979. It's a very interesting story that hopefully Mark will get into. The first parade in New Orleans for Pride took place in 1980. And throughout the 1980s, Pride was very closely, or loosely, I should say, affiliated with an annual conference called Celebration, which grew out of some political action groups that were active in the 80s. In the 1990s, the Pride Parade was produced under the auspices of a group called the Alliance for Pride, and then it eventually went to the Community Center, which is how it's done in most cities. The Community Center had produced the Pride Parade until 2011. when the most recent incarnation of the Pride organization took over. The problem with that is that in the last several years, there have been a lot of complaints and criticisms leveled at the way Pride has been run. And the chief complaints were that it was very exclusionary, too gay male centric. A lot of people felt left out, especially the African American community and the trans community in particular. And the other criticism was that it was too corporate, and some people had a problem with the police presence. After all, Pride grew, and Stonewall was a revolt against police brutality. So that those criticisms and those some might say resentments began to manifest. And in 2016, Black Pride of New Orleans was created. And nationally, Black Pride goes all the way back to 1991 in Washington, D.C., but that group formed in 2016. And in 2018, the People's Assembly and the New Orleans Workers Group started a movement to take back Pride, and they have conducted marches or parades each year. This year, they did the Motorcade for Pride, which some people may have heard of. And I just want to say before I wrap up that when this panel was put together, it was before the recent blow up with Pride. And the idea was just to focus on the history, but in light of recent developments with Pride, the whole board resigning and all the other rigmarole, it's a very timely panel discussion, because even though our focus tonight is on the history of Pride, and our speakers will be speaking primarily to what they experienced in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's really useful to know our history because it paves a way for us to go forward. So whatever the next incarnation of Pride is going to be, I think, should be informed by a knowledge of what has happened in the past. And so that's what I'm hoping we get out of this tonight, in addition to a lot of great memories and information. So thank you for putting this together, Jim.
All right, thank you for that, Frank. So now let's meet some of the folks who were active during the early years of New Orleans Pride. Michael Hickerson is a longtime New Orleans activist. He was Queen of New Orleans Pride and also a Grand Marshal for the Pride Parade in the early 80s. And he was also a Southern Decadence Grand Marshal in 1985. He was also involved in organizing various Pride events over the years in New Orleans. He's a social worker by profession and has worked with people living with HIV. Valda Lewis is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. She was the producer for Just for the Record. You just saw some clips from that, an LGBT community access television program that aired in New Orleans from 1986 to 1993. Mark Gonzalez helped start Gay Fest in the late 70s. Gay Fest was the first major Pride-related event in New Orleans. Mark was also instrumental in starting the New Orleans chapter of ACT UP and AIDS Law of Louisiana. He's a member of the board of directors for the LGBT+ Archives Project of Louisiana and is a lawyer in private practice here in New Orleans. And Dr. Catherine Roden is a therapist in private practice and currently works with Sage New Orleans and Crescent Care. As co-creator of NOAH, or New Orleans Women Against AIDS, and chair of community relief for people with AIDS during the mid to late 80s and early 90s. She was involved in early Gay Fest gatherings and parades, early New Orleans Pride and celebration, blending her AIDS work with political action in the city of New Orleans. The first question I have for everybody, all the panelists, is how did you first get involved with New Orleans Pride celebrations? And Mark, since you were involved with starting the first Gay Fest, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, thanks for putting this together, Jim. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with other panelists, and we can get some of the questions at the bottom of our screen. Somebody's going to be talking about the fire at the upstairs lounge later, but let me talk a little bit about what things were like back when we started Gay Fest. It was so different from today, and it's difficult to I guess, put a handle on it because we're so used to the world that we're living in with the internet and with email and with social media. Try to understand and appreciate that 40 years ago, GayFest started around 1979. 40 years ago, you didn't have any of that. And what you had was essentially, you had gay bars, lesbian bars, and gay bars. There were a couple other organizations about to start or that had been going on as social organizations, Gertrude Stein Society. But for the most part, organizing back then was organizing from within and with the bars and the bar owners and people that went to bars. It was really a way different time. And when we first tried to get let me get with the start. So the Pink Triangle Alliance was really instrumental in us doing something more than just a parade. And we had a meeting, and a handful of people got together at somebody's house on Magazine Street, if I remember this, and we basically brainstormed, what do we need to do? And even back then, New Orleans was known as a festival place. So it was very natural to start calling this Gay Fest. And it helped us to actually get more people involved. And the place you started back then was with the bars and the bar owners. And that was reflective of the community. So I don't know, Michael, maybe you could tell me, but I don't know that there were any black gay bars back then.
They were.
There were 2 or 3 women's bars. There were, Michael?
Yes, they were black gay bars. There was 1 black gay bar back there.
Okay, and unfortunately we didn't involve them or hear from them. Obviously the owners would have been invited, because what we did is, so let me tell you the mechanics of this. One of our members went to City Hall and got approval to have the Gay Fest at Jackson Square. And then the city authorities realized what the hell they had done, and immediately told us, no, you're not going to have Gay Fest in front of a Catholic church at Jackson Square. We're not closing down Jackson Square for a gay festival. And because they had already promised it to us and we're now taking it away, we pretty much got the choice of any other park in the city. And we looked at the various parks, and Washington Square seemed ideal. But then we were told, okay, you can have Washington Square, but you can't do any activities inside the park. So we were then forced to have anything selling or making food or selling to be outside the park. Well, Washington Square had this wonderful, and still has this wonderful wrought iron fence. And that became kind of the structure for Gay Fest for several years. And so we basically had a nice backboard for everybody to put their booths up, and we sold booths. And of course we sold booths mostly to the bars and the bar owners and other organizations. If it was a nonprofit, it got it, cheaper for nothing. Whereas if you were going to be selling something, you paid a little bit more. One of the points I really want to make, Jim, and to everybody, is that a small number of people can do amazing things. Gay Fest didn't start because 100 people came to a meeting and decided to organize. It was literally less than 10 people in a room, and one person generously, literally, I remember this like it was yesterday, wrote a check for $500 and said, "Here, start it." And that's how it happens. And this is borne out through ACT UP as well. ACT UP was able to do amazing things with a handful of well-organized, committed people. And Gay Fest started that way too. And I wanted to point out a couple things from what we've seen from Valda Lewis's nice video. We see Charlene wearing a hat saying that all we see is Dukes. I want everybody to understand that hat said no Dukes. And this was back in the day when everybody, and the gay community was very involved in this too. We're like, we've got to get rid of David Duke. So that's what that hat was about. And I guess I've spoken enough.
Thank you, Mark. Michael, I'd like to move to you next. And just to repeat the question, how did you, and if you want to answer something that he just said, the question is, how did you get involved with New Orleans Pride celebrations? But feel free to speak on whatever you want to speak on.
Sure. Let me just first say thank you for, and thank you to the panelists for inviting me to participate in this event. I think it's long needed. We need to understand where we come from in order to get to, I believe, where we're going. When I became a part of Gay Pride, it was called Gay Fest back then. I believe it was in 1981. I met Mark Gonzalez and Dick O'Connor and of course Charlene Snyder back then. Somehow, and I still don't know, but somehow I got to be queen. Yes, I got to be queen of Gay Pride in I believe it was in 1981. Charlene Snyder's partner at that time, Angela, she was my king. I want to fast forward to 1982. In 1982, I was elected director of Gay Pride. Mark was a part of Gay Pride back then, Dick O'Connor, I want to say Billy Henry and Dennis Jean, we were all a part of Gay Pride. Gay Pride was difficult. I want to talk about some of the things that Mark talked about. I mean, Gay Pride, organizing Gay Pride back then was really, really, really a grassroots event. It was a knock on doors and sit down and talk to people and get people involved. I mean, it was door to door walking to get people involved. We had no internet back then. We had none of that stuff. You know, you really needed to literally meet people where they were. And most of the people were in the bars. So we had to go to the bars and talk our game and convince people and talk to people and tell people how important it was for us to have this Gay Pride. Getting the bar owners on board were the biggest challenges. We had to convince them because they literally had the money. They were the ones who were funding Gay Pride. We didn't have corporate sponsors or anything like that. The community funded Gay Pride. And what we did it off the kindness and the generosity of the community. Mark talked about the boots that we sold at Gay Pride, you know, well, bar owners bought them, organizations bought them, and they sold goods and services was there, all these kind of things, you know, and it made for a wonderful event, but it was difficult. It was difficult because you had to get people on the same page and get them to believe in what you were doing. You know, I spent many, many nights in bars talking to people, you know. I mean, Mark would perhaps go to one bar, I'd go to another bar, and we just talk about Gay Pride and talk about the vision that we had. That year, when I was director of Gay Pride, the theme that year was "We Are Everywhere." And that was the first year we had real Mardi Gras float. And the floats went through, we had a route and it went through the French Quarter. We rented like, I think maybe about 7 Blaine Kern floats. And these floats represented different professions that gay people are in, you know, and the theme was "We Are Everywhere." It was a wonderful turnout, but it was a lot of work. I think Gay Pride has evolved. It's come a long way, but I still think it's a community event. And I believe in order to have a successful Gay Pride, we need to involve community. We need to make sure that we have community involvement, community input, and community from all over, not just from the gay white male community, but all over. You know, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to include the entire community.
Thank you, Michael. Mark, I'm gonna get back to you. I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to answer. Catherine, can you say how you first got involved with New Orleans Pride celebrations?
Sure. I think for me, and Mark mentioned celebration, which was something completely different from Pride, but those gatherings during the early 80s, before we realized what was happening in the epidemic in our own community with AIDS. But those gatherings were wonderful. We would teach things, there were seminars, there was entertainment, there was dancing, partying. The first few that I went to were in a hotel on Carrollton and near Tulane, the Fontainebleau, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And it was literally dangerous in some ways to go to some of those activities because it was a different time, you know, in my life. I was at a Catholic institution working as a dean, and there's no way, but I did not go. So part of this is when I realized the power that we had as a community, as a small group of people, to celebrate a little bit more and do a few other things and then get involved with United Services for AIDS and those kinds of things. And then I remember my very first Pride that I went to, that I wasn't involved in, but I went to, I just was a kid in the candy store. I didn't know what to do first. I was excited. It was marvelous. It was literally celebratory. And whatever kind of a parade there was, it didn't matter. We all had a great time. My real involvement, Jim, though, to your question, is during the time when we realized what was going on in our community and our crisis and our epidemic. And I'll talk more about the women of Pride and New Orleans in a little bit, but that did it because we felt a call. And although there were very few women involved with Pride at that time, very few involved with actual Pride, we were always treated beautifully in terms of booths for NOAA and then community relief with Al McNair and all that sort of thing. My experience was marvelous around that, but mostly we used it then. One of the reasons that I got involved was because it was a forum, and there didn't seem to be a real safe forum back then. And suddenly Pride came up, Gay Fest, and then Pride. It was safe, whether we were in the gates of Washington Park or we were in the gates of what was then Congo Square and then Armstrong Park. It was just there. I felt protected within those gates. It's a little different these days, I suspect, for everybody, you know. So I think that's how I got pulled in big time.
Thank you, Catherine. Valda, how did you get involved with Pride celebrations in New Orleans?
Well, for me, it was an obvious thing to document. You know, we were out running around with cameras, putting on the TV show, but it was also about keeping a historical record. And so the first Pride that I went to would have been '88, and then we just saw from '89. I think what I loved about it was that it was a 2-day event. So you had this fabulous parade, and then you had a lot of the political stuff, and the people that wanted to show up would show up, and as years went by, there would be more politicians that would come. And then you'd have all day Sunday where everybody was just having a really good time, great bands. We had the Charlene Neville, we had a dog show that went on every year. And everybody, just like, as Kathy was saying, you know, it felt safe. Everybody was just having like a really good time. But as you can see from the parade footage, it was a very political time. I mean, we were not just AIDS, which was huge, of course, but we were looking at gays in the military, you know, the sodomy laws, you know, we were talking about gay marriage. There was so many other, you know, the rights to be able to go visit people in the hospital. There were so many other things that were so important, the Civil Rights Ordinance notwithstanding. And I think, you know, with AIDS, it sort of solidified the movement and pushed all of those other issues forward. Now, whether or not that's supposed to be a built-in part of Pride or not, it was in those days because it was a time to let everybody else know what was going on. but really, getting the word out, as Mark was saying, it was really the gay bars that we would do that, to get the word out about the TV show. If you wanted people to get involved in anything, that was your starting place, because, there just wasn't any other way. We had a mailing list. I think we had about 2,400 people on that, but we'd have to put it in an envelope, sealed envelope, and mail things out. So it was a very different time in terms of that communication. But so it was a marvelous weekend. And Gay Fest, like Crawfish Fest or this fest and that, it was a great way to push it out there and for people to really see each other. I can remember people coming into the park and, like almost in tears, thinking, I knew this was happening, and I've just, there's just so many other people like me here, and I'm having such a great time, So it was a great event to cover. It really was.
Thank you, Valda. And just a word for attendees. The Archives Project helped fund the digitization of Just for the Record. And I'm going to be sending an email to all of you who attended or registered that will have links so you can watch some of the full shows, Just for the Record.
Yep.
And some other resources. Mark, you wanted to add a word in.
Just following up on what Michael said about how diversity was important and how much hard work this was. And I want to also just point out that it wasn't just the gay bars, but of course they were instrumental, but there were a lot of gay restaurants then too. There was Petunia's and the Apple Barrel. And I remember distinctly with Dick O'Connor, you'd go and have breakfast at one of the restaurants and something, because you were going to meet other people and kind of encourage them to be involved in Gay Fest. And one day a guy walks in at the door and I say to Dick, is he gay? And he goes, oh no, he's not gay. He's enchanted, which I just love. So it was very much like that. And diversity was very important, and really important to understand that it was very much community-based. It wasn't, we didn't have any corporation that said, oh, let us buy your $2,000 worth of wiring so that you can have electricity at the booths. It was very much
beer truck, maybe.
we did have a beer truck, and that's how we made money as well. God knows that. But it was pretty much the community buying a booth that was going to pay for the expenses of putting on the festival, and hopefully they would make their money back with what they were selling.
Right. Well, it was the same with the TV show. I mean, the only way we survived was with $30 ads from the bars and the restaurants and other gay business and individuals, because that was the only way to do it. There was no funding. There is no funding for this kind of stuff, generally speaking, still even today.
Michael, did you want to?
Let me just reiterate that it is important that we have community. I mean, if you're going to celebrate a gay pride in the city has to be included. The gay community as a whole has to be included. So often we tend to do things like this in silos, little groups getting together and deciding what's best for everyone without everyone's participation. Of course, you're not going to get everyone to participate, but you want to have as much representation from your community and have your board and all these other committees, mirror your community. That way you get the best input and ultimately get the best outcome. Yeah.
I'd like to circle back to something that Catherine brought up. I think that the shadow that was over this period that you all were involved was AIDS. And I'd like to, Catherine, could you talk about some of the various AIDS-related organizations you were involved with that supported Gay Fest or Gay Pride during this time?
Sure. Well, probably the most important one at that time was No AIDS Task Force, which is Crescent Care, legally, and still is Crescent Care, but it's under a different name, and a lot of things are different now. But I think No AIDS and Gay Fest and then Pride were very closely related. I can remember Gay Fest, I thought about this a lot in terms of timing. So I would say in my experience from about 88 to 91 or 2, maybe even 87, the majority of the booths at Pride were around services for people with AIDS. There were a lot of other booths, but a lot of the booths that weren't around those organizations gave money to AIDS. So it was, as I'm hearing from a couple of people, it was absolutely about community. Those were the days before the city of New Orleans did anything for our community in terms of that. I don't know how to talk about Pride or anything else and not talk about the AIDS epidemic. And I think we don't do that enough here, whether we don't know about it, people are too young, they don't remember it, or there's just a bad memory and it's painful to people. That was part of our strength. That was part of our strength, knowing that all the diversity that we're talking about came together because AIDS didn't discriminate at all. There was no discrimination around it. It got to all quarters. So NOAA, New Orleans Women Against AIDS, was something that a couple of us started. I have my pin still. I have about 4 of these pins with me. And what we did was simply to raise money for No AIDS Task Force. So that was exactly why we started. There were a group of lesbians getting together. We didn't know what to do. We saw our brothers dying, literally dying in front of us. They were fine on Thursday, and 2 weeks later they had an HIV diagnosis. It was a horrific time, horrific, tragic time. And we didn't know what the heck to do because we were the girls and we weren't involved in a lot of things. And so we did that. That was one thing we did. And then community relief for people with AIDS. Some of you would remember that, I hope. And a man named Al McNairn, now passed on, only to heaven would Al go, started that out of the back of his restaurant, Community Relief, which was on the corner of Frenchman and Burgundy for years. It was, I'm sorry?
La Peniche.
La Peniche. La Peniche. It's where the old Apple Barrel used to be, and then he bought it. So it was La Peniche. And he very quietly started that. And 6 months later, there was an organization that he completely funded at the beginning. He completely funded it. He paid for people's anything, their medical expenses, PWAs, people with AIDS, their rent, their bills for anything. People who wanted to go to the dentist, Al would pay for it. So then we got together with him, then we started raising money for that. So that was what the women did. I want to say this, I don't want to talk too much, but I want to say this. I know sometimes we think that the communities were so apart, especially the gender-based communities, the males and females. That was never my experience in New Orleans. I'm not born and bred here. But when I came in 1977, that's not what I found, and it isn't what I found during the time I was working with the AIDS epidemic, and maybe that's why. The men supported us 100%. How many sock hops, how many people, Lynn Lavner, a very well-known singer at that time in New York, we brought her 3 times here. And all that money went to community relief and or No AIDS. I felt like our brothers were wonderful and our community was very different now. It's not that it's not wonderful now, it's just different. There was a common goal, like we're saying, it was a community goal. And Pride got it all together. It I think, coalesced at Pride, working with it, being there for all those years. So that's a little bit of few things I recall.
What about I'd like to, create some space for the rest of you to speak to what Catherine's been bringing up about In the Shadow of AIDS and how that brought people together, or whatever your experience was at the time.
Well, I did find that, most of the time, we might go out to Metairie, to the bar there, and because they had a crawfish bar, we try and shoot all sorts of different things. But then it always would be like a portion of the money was going to go to AIDS. I will always remember Michael doing drag bingo, which was just fabulous. And that was, great. The money went to AIDS. Just about anything that we were covering, that it was a community event, either all of the money or some of the money was going to the task force or the Buzzies Boys or the Lazarus House. I mean, it just was an everyday part of our lives. And we didn't really have time to fight or have differences. I mean, they just, even though lesbians weren't physically affected by AIDS, we were affected by our community not getting the help that was needed, and the discrimination was blanket across the board, not just because they were gay men. It was because they were gay, you know,
Sure.
like we were gay. So it was like, your community doesn't count. And so we had a common goal in terms of that, and really, like, you know, watching these guys really just disappearing back into the universe, getting every day thinner and thinner. So it is a painful time to recall. And I think that Pride was a great way of bringing everybody together and getting that kind of release with so many other people at the same time.
Mark, you had a hand up?
Yeah, we need to understand, I guess, to some extent, but back then it wasn't the LGBT community. It was pretty much the gay and lesbian community. And
That's how we
it was
named
really, it's amazing how selfless the lesbian and women's community was. Whereas Valda just mentioned, you know, women weren't as affected by AIDS as the gay community, the men's
Lesbians.
gay community was.
Lesbians, women could get AIDS. Lesbians were, you know, I don't even really believe that there was any lesbian to lesbian transmission, but
I agree.
that was because we were, you know, it's like nuns didn't get it either, you know.
But my point merely, Valda, was that it was the women's community that really stepped up to do a lot with regard to helping people who were HIV
Dying.
positive.
Yes.
It was really amazing, and we, the entire community owes a great debt to the women's community that stepped up to help.
I think it was a compulsion. I don't think we had a choice.
Yes.
We, you know, it was impossible to sit by and watch anything like that happen. So, you know, you just did it. You just stepped up, and everybody was front and center.
Yes.
So I love the Lesbian Avengers. They showed them in the clip, and their motto was "We recruit," which queer nation, all of those kinds of things, you know, where people found their own niche in ways that they were going to address this issue. So,
Yes.
Michael,
so
did you want to
Pride
add?
was key.
I think I want to say, I think the AIDS epidemic is sort of like the coronavirus. It made people stop and pay attention. It brought out compassion in people. I think more like the Black Lives Matter movement. It's bringing out a lot of compassion in people from areas that you can't imagine. You know, I mean, it's a movement. You know, well, I think when the HIV epidemic hit New Orleans, we stopped. Our community, we stopped, and we paid attention, and we got on board to begin to help each other.
Catherine?
Yeah, just to Michael, yeah, I agree with you. It's much more parallel in my mind to Black Lives Matter than
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because it kept happening and people were dying in front of us.
Exactly.
Although there wasn't the media like now. So when we needed to march on Washington, which I did twice, it was to let the White House know that we were here. It wasn't, there was no media. For those who don't remember that, it would be very hard, I think, to conceptualize that. When we did ACT UP, and, you know, when we came in cars from NOAA, all these women who had never, I can assure you, lesbians in those cars had never laid down in front of City Hall in the street before. You know, and I don't know if that was something you at that point was involved, I don't know, but we did that a bunch of times, and you know what? We got some play, you know, so those were different kinds of protests. But we were mad.
Yes.
We were mad. We were all mad, and we needed to be mad.
Some of us still are.
You wanna speak
Yes,
to
ma'am.
Mark?
So
do you
one
wanna-
of, one of the panelists just mentioned that the reality that back then we had a president who couldn't even use the word AIDS. And today we have this psychopath who is just blatantly racist. And and it gets kind of back to what Michael pointed out, which is it's a matter of the community. And what happened with Black Lives Matter is you just can't get away from the fact that somebody is saying, I can't breathe, and his last words are his mother's name.
Yeah.
So back in our day, while it wasn't on the news, we saw our friends coming down with Kaposi's sarcoma, and it was just, you can't deny this. You can't sleep. You can't deny it. And it was very motivating.
Michael, I'd like to ask you a question about this. I've read several interviews and watched several interviews that you've done about your experience with, the deep segregation that has plagued the gay community, the LGBT community, for a long time. For example, I read that you were the first African-American member of Amun-Ra, and some people left when that happened. And I guess my question is for you, can you speak to that experience? How segregated was Pride? And how far do we have to go? Is there hope? I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but
and I hope I can give you some answers. Pride, when I first joined Pride or got involved with Pride, and I'll be very honest with you, I knew that there were very little African American participation. I did not understand why. I knew I was living or enjoying a community that was predominantly white, and I had many Black and white friends, this is where I was at that time, I got involved in the community. I tried to bring my friends into the community as much as I possibly could, or as much as they would let me bring them into the community. But there was never a sense that the white community invited participation. We had, I lived in two worlds. I lived in a world that had bars on the river side of Rampart Street, French Quarter. And I lived in another world that had a bar on the other side of Rampart Street going towards the lake, like Claiborne Avenue. So I played between both worlds. I did. I played between both worlds, trying to get both worlds together. But I was just a Black boy back then, I had no clout. I had nothing. I had to get to that point to be able to do some of the things that I've done. Let me just talk briefly about the Crew of Amun-Ra. I'd gotten to the point where I'd started a Mardi Gras organization and I wanted to join the Crew of Amun-Ra. And it was it's embarrassing to say. However, there was some racial issues that tried to prevent me from becoming a member of the organization, but the majority of the members of the organization saw differently. Yeah. And that's all I'll say about that. It's been some trying times, but all in all, we're getting there. We're getting there. Opportunities are there for all of us to be a part of this wonderful community that we have. What we have to do is just make sure that the message gets to everyone. And I want to say that we have to involve the community in everything we do. That includes Gay Pride, Southern Decadence, all of those community events. And that's what they are. They're community events. And if they're community events, I believe communities should be involved.
Shifting gears a bit, I wanted to ask Valda a question. Valda documented New Orleans Pride celebrations for years, for the record, and the cable access show. Can you tell us about what was it? Just to put it in context for maybe younger people who didn't understand maybe what it was like during the 80s. How hard was it to get people to talk on camera when they weren't to their families? You know?
Right, that's an interesting question. Of course, you know, the parade was, you know, pretty much open season. You know, if you were in the parade and screaming from a truck, then, you know, most of the time people were waving at the camera. But in the park, and at most events, you know, that like a celebration, we would only have the camera pointed towards the stage. And then we would go around the park and ask people first if they would be willing to be on camera. If there's shots of people, it's usually from a distance, you know, the overview, because generally speaking, if you're in public, you're in the public domain and you don't have to have permission to film people. But we were very sensitive to that issue, that people didn't necessarily want to be on camera. And we had a lot of people like this, you know, walking past and doing this because they saw the camera. So we were very mindful. But as the years went by, it became easier and easier. And because we got better and better at what we were doing, you know, we started with a single camera, and then we were doing 2 cameras. And by 1993, we were live mixing 3 cameras, and half the time I was just overseeing. It was so many volunteers were so keen to help out with it. But yeah, you know, we had to be very sensitive to that.
So fast forward on what Valda just talked about, it was only recently that the Supreme Court said you can't discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation. So this is just new. But back then, it wasn't somebody was going to be embarrassed because somebody was going to know they were gay. They could lose their job. And you lose your job, you lose your apartment, and you lose your place to live, and possibly some of your friends or your family's support. It was really, it was a whole panoply of things that frightened people from going on camera. And you know, Valda had to respect that. And then when there were people that were willing to go on camera, you know, more power to them, like Michael.
Yeah,
you know, I'm going to acknowledge that we're getting so many great questions, and I'll try to get to some of them. Valda, did you have more to say about that?
No, I think Mark, you know, really clarified what I was saying. I mean, you really made the point that it wasn't just that we were being polite, we were being extremely mindful that we weren't just going to destroy somebody's life, and didn't want to put people off from being in the park. Oh, you know, we're going because there's cameras, blah, blah, blah. So we, you know, we were mindful like that. But it's true, yeah, people did lose their jobs.
Right.
It wasn't just they could, I mean, they did. So, so thank you for going deeper there, Mark. It's very important.
All right. Let's see. Mark, I have a question for you. So aside from the obvious differences in technology, I mean, we've got the internet now and social media and all that. What do you find to be the major differences between organizing in the LGBT community when you start, as opposed to 40 years ago when you started and today?
Well, I think we touched upon it. Back then, the community was, to a great extent, it was gay bars and restaurants and several organizations, but that's the way it was back then, and you deal with what you have. Maybe Michael will talk more about this. Yeah, I see you shaking your head, Michael.
Well, and we did put up signs in gay bars and restaurants and stuff, letting the community know that we were having a meeting. And when we had these meetings, we tried to have them in safe spaces. We tried to have them in spaces that, how do you say that? Well, let me just say we used to have our meetings in spaces that was free to everyone. That wasn't a gay bar where the bar owner had to say so over the meeting, or, you know, we had them in spaces that was neutral. We had them in neutral spaces, and everybody was invited to attend.
And I'll comment too, Michael, that, you know, we've left out churches. So there was actually a lot of support by the churches.
Sure.
That ACT UP was meeting in churches, ACT UP was meeting in non-gay spaces. And I just wanted to point that out.
Sure.
I'm not trying to.
No, you're right. We met at St. Mark's Church. We met at this, and I don't know the name of the church, but it's on the corner of Rampart and Barracks.
Mm-hmm.
Right there. That's where, in 1982, that's where we used to have our Gay Fest meetings at that church. You know, we met in spaces where it was accessible to the community. And if you weren't a drinker or anything like that, you could come to those places. And we met in places where you could talk to people. You know, it wasn't loud music or anything like that. It was about business. It was about trying to get a community together and rally around an event that benefited the entire community.
Catherine and Velda.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned churches, and they were pretty much the only place that you could meet around no AIDS or anything like that. They were large enough. They didn't have people hovering when you did have people come in. And again, to put it in perspective, in terms of time, this was during the time that the only HIV testing you could get was not, it wasn't private, it wasn't anonymous. It was pretty much before No AIDS started, it was through the state system. And that's when people got fired. Today that wouldn't happen. That's what happened then. And then we started doing testing in that very church on Barracks and Rampart. We had to creep around to get what we needed to do that test, not the testing, but talking to people, counseling around it. But it was in a church, once again, you're absolutely right. And Bubba's Lounge. Don't forget Bubba's Lounge.
Bubba's Lounge.
Don't forget. I don't know. I mean, I feel I could even describe the back room now. It's been so many years. We were allowed free access to that. It was a phone call. It was a phone call. You know, we need to meet here. Okay, when are you coming? You know, and it was amazing. Even though it was a bar, we were in the back. No one bothered us. No one, I felt like, looked at us. And this wasn't just women. This was everybody. So there were very good-hearted people here, smart people here at that time to help us organize, do what we needed to do. That's what I feel. Because it was smaller, I think we got more done.
Velda and then Frank.
Well, one of the things I remember, because of, you know, the meetings and being in safe spaces and neutral spaces, was that there was always good food. So
yes,
absolutely. I mean, when I moved from New Orleans and I went to a meeting somewhere else, I'm like, where's the food, right? You know? The other thing is, of course, you know, we do bulk emails right now. Hands up all of those that ever did a bulk mailing.
Oh, listen.
Oh, you couldn't pay me $1 million to do.
Oh, Lord. Licking stamps.
Licking stamps, sorting out the zip codes and bundling them up, and oh my God! But hey, another community meeting right there. Just sit around and have pizza, a couple of beers, and just lick the stamps, right?
It brought community together. You know, it brought the community together. Nowadays, you just press a button and it all goes. You know, yeah.
Frank,
like flicking a bic instead of banging two sticks together, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the church on the corner of Rampart and Barracks that a few people have mentioned was the St. Louis Community Center.
Yeah.
Which basically served as a de facto gay and lesbian community center before the actual community center was founded in 1992. And that was because of the generosity and benevolence of a closeted gay priest who was there.
Yes. I remember him.
Yeah.
It gets back to the idea that actually a small number of really committed people can make big changes. And it was the leader of that and St. Mark's. Those churches were run by people that were supportive, and it made all the difference in the world. And you know, Al at La Peniche making all the difference in the world. So I want to just, I guess, emphasize to people that you can make a big difference too by getting involved.
Yeah, but what I think, but you know, for me today, I don't know where it is. I don't know how to get involved. Where is it? You know, I mean,
It's on Broad Street.
you know, well, I know where the community center is, but is that where the Pride meetings are held? You know, when are they held? You know,
The Archives Project would love to get more of the community on our board. And if you're listening to this, think about volunteering with the LGBT plus Archives Project and maybe volunteering as a board member.
I'd like to kind of start looking at a couple of the questions we've got. I wish we could get to all of them, but the first one, I see one from Blake Roberts, and he asks, why did the name change from Gay Fest to Gay Pride? I think that's because different organizations were doing it, and maybe it wasn't originally called Pride, but I want to follow that one up with a question. Oh, where's Kentucky? She's asking, what is unique about New Orleans Pride that would be different from other Pride celebrations across the country? So maybe if someone wants to answer one or both of those questions.
That's for you, Frank.
Yeah, I'm thinking Frank, the historian. Maybe, what's different about our Pride, Frank? And why do they change the name?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities to other cities, but I would say the primary difference is that what we now call Pride Parades started out as angry protest marches. And in New Orleans, the very first parade grew out of not an angry group of people, but rather they deliberately made the choice to have a festival, because the sensibility of New Orleans is not normally one that people associate with angry protest marches. Now, some people have argued that we should return to that, and I think they make a good point. But the difference is, and this kind of goes to another question that somebody sent in about Southern decadence, right? In New Orleans, every Labor Day weekend, you know, 250,000 people come to celebrate Southern decadence. It's pretty gay male centric, but a lot of people confuse the two and think, why do we have Pride if we have Southern decadence? Isn't that the same thing? And they're really not. Southern decadence did not begin as a gay event, believe it or not. And it was a house party in 1972 that gradually evolved, didn't really get gay until the 80s. But in many respects, today, Pride in New Orleans is different than other Pride celebrations because the parades, if you notice the last couple of years, none of the gay bars participate in the parade, which is odd because in most cities they do. So there are some similarities, but also some differences. And I think it has to do with the sensibility of New Orleans and especially the leadership of Pride over the last 9 years has something to do with that as well.
Okay. Looking at some of these different questions, Ron Julian is asking, is there a collection of these photos? I think he was referring to Velda's video, and Ron, I think that may be another thing that Frank would know more about, where the better collections of these photos are stored in archives, and what people can do if they have those photos.
If anyone has photos that they would like to be preserved or posted on the LGBT Plus Archives website, we would love to have them. And if you're interested in actually donating the hard copy photos to an area repository, we can certainly walk you through that process as well. At present, I am not aware of any institution that has a Pride collection, although a few places do have what's called ephemera, like brochures, programs from different Pride Fests over the years.
I've got a collection.
do you?
I got
I thought you would.
I'm a hoarder.
I'm just looking at some of these questions. People are, some of them, I don't know if we can tie that into Pride, but
I'd like to know, where does everybody think Pride's going to be? I mean, how's it going to be going forward? I mean, what does it look like?
Well,
That's
that
a
was
$64,000 question right now.
that brings me to my question for everybody, or at least it ties into it. We've got these deep inequalities still in the community. We're still dealing with it, but we've made a lot of strides, and things are very different today than during the period we talked about when people didn't want to be on camera. People were afraid to be out. Well, now people are less afraid to be out. And there are other communities that are finding their voice. What is next for Pride?
If I could jump in on that, I think there has to be a stronger, more visible trans presence. The T in LGBTQ has often been the redheaded stepchild for too long. And I think the trans people need more visibility in Pride and need to be much more involved.
You know, how do you get involved with Pride when you don't know? You know, I think there's a lack of communication, a lack of accountability to the community. Pride is a community event. We should know about these things, especially given the fact we have this modern technology now. You know, I mean, it has to be a community event, and it has to be some accountability to the community in order to make this thing work.
Well, you're absolutely right, Michael, and that's one of the criticisms that have been leveled against the Pride organization that just dissolved, was that it was not a community-based event. They were not very open to feedback or reaching out to people. So that's something that needs to change.
Sure. I mean, how do you I mean, I don't even know who is representing me, because I am a part of this community. We all are a part of this community. And I think I've been a part of this, I'm speaking for myself now. I think I've been a part of this community probably much longer than the people who are running Pride now. You know, I mean, that speaks to my age, my grandpa-ness, you know. But anyway, there needs to be some accountability. I mean, there isn't any. We know nothing. You know, I know about Pride the day before Pride, the parade is going to happen, you know, and that's probably because I was in the bars and I just happened to hear about it, you know. I mean, Pride was a community event. It was a community event.
Valda?
Well, I think going back, I don't know what happens now in New Orleans, whether it is just the parade, but I mean, the big community, not everybody wants to be in the parade, and it's like, oh, it's another parade. But the whole weekend at the park, the festival part of it was what brought people together, I felt, and people would be more likely to want to be in that community space like that.
Frank and then Mark. And then
yeah, I just wanted to throw this out for people who are watching that may not be aware. The organization that's been doing Pride, I think it was called Pride New Orleans, for the last 9 years, just recently kind of blew up internally. There was a big controversy earlier this month, and the executive president resigned, and then the board eventually resigned, and we don't need to go into all that now. But the point is that the organization that has been producing Pride for the last 9 years is no more. And there have been a lot of meetings behind the scenes. I don't think anything has been reincarnated yet. So people who are asking, how do I get involved? What do I do? The answer is we don't know yet. It's really in transition right now. So it's a great opportunity to rebuild it in a more positive way.
I think someone asked, how did the name change? You know, this is how the name changes. You know, this group of people who are under this name, it blows up and it goes away, and then here comes another name. That's how the name changes.
I got Mark, and then Catherine, and then Valda.
I like to go forward from where we are right now, and maybe let's have this meeting become the impetus to following up on what Michael said and what Frank just said. Let's make sure that from this day forward, we're either getting hold of our gay paper, we're getting hold of the bar owners and maybe doing a flyer, and we start letting people know how to become involved in Pride New Orleans. I mean, it's a two-way street, Michael, and I'm as
Sure.
guilty as anybody. I have to also go out and maybe pick up a paper or go and find a flyer or something. But if it's not out there, if it's not in the paper, or if there's no flyer, you don't know. So I think we ought to, and maybe even put it on our website, the LGBT Archives website. Here's when the next meeting of Pride New Orleans is, and here's how to volunteer. And I think we ought to be doing something affirmative from today forward to make sure that this becomes transparent and changes, because it's I don't want to hear about it, like Michael said. I don't want to hear about it, you know, the day before there's a meeting at such and such and you're missing it.
You know,
Well, I want to go to Michael. Let me go to Catherine first. Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting to hear you guys talk like this. One of the things I wanted to say whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion, those are two different things. You can invite somebody, but then you have to include them.
sure.
It's a world apart when you're saying it's going to be a gay pride parade at 7 o'clock at night. The first time I heard that, I'm like, what happened to the daytime? And then what happens to, as Val was talking about, the celebration in a park, you know, or something like that. And the other thing is when you, and I will say this too, as somebody who's been pretty active for a long time, you got to be willing to be active. It's one thing to say they didn't do whatever, but you got to have a group of people who are really, really going to say, I'll be active and I can bring 2 people. You know, something like that. So I think we have a fabulous opportunity here. I think I'm very excited. I've been excited about this for a long time, a month or so since it happened. So let's do it.
Then Michael.
So, yeah, it was like a point of clarification. There's a national pride
Yep.
movement that set the theme every year. And so when New Orleans joined that and that became more of a national thing, then that's when it changed from Gay Fest to Gay Pride. And so it's a national theme that all the cities use. You know, I guess I don't know if they still do that or whether they can, you know, they're arguing about what the theme should be, but that, generally speaking, at that time, that's why it changed from Gay Fest to Gay Pride. That's all I know.
Michael, did you want to add something?
No, I'm good. Thank you. I think I've talked enough.
Me too.
Looking at some of these questions, Kristen asked, what is New Orleans Pride? Is it just a parade plus parties and bars? And, you know, I hope that Kristen and everybody is going to look at some of these more of these videos from Just for the Record. It wasn't. It was, you know, like Valda was just saying, there was one of the years there was a big tent and all the different groups had their table. And this is what y'all were saying was where people had a chance to kind of meet. I mean, with a parade, that's fun and all. But when you can kind of around to different organizations, oh, this exists. You know, I didn't know that there was, you know,
Register to vote.
or there was, I didn't know there was an ACT UP in New Orleans, you know, back then. So yeah, I think to answer Kristen's question, no, it was more than just a parade. And that has been the case, I know, in recent years, because we did some, like Sage, we had a tent, but it's always very hot. Was Pride always held in the month of June in New Orleans?
No.
No. I think they moved, it was held in October.
Right.
Yeah, but then we realized that that was hurricane season, you know, and then moved it back to the original time, which is in June. I think that's when it's celebrated nationally, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
In June,
Yeah, June.
during
Yeah,
Stonewall.
Yeah. right.
Valdo, did you?
Well,
wanna say-
there was other events too, you know, as I'm looking at other tapes and digitizing stuff here. there's an art festival where they invited all the LGBT artists to put their artwork, and they'd sell them, and they'd sort of maybe either they could or they by choice give some back to Pride. There'd be a lot of other spin-off. I did a film festival every year that went along with Celebration and Pride at the Marigny Theater. So we would show queer films. That was part of Pride, and there'd be other events in the bars raising money for the big event, the parade and the festival in the park. So it wasn't just a sort of a one weekend, it was a build up of the whole. We celebrated throughout June, and it would culminate in this big parade. And so you get people involved on all sorts of different levels like
That's
that.
right. That's right.
The heat definitely makes it hard. I've got a question for Frank. I think we did. What social media handles should we follow if we want to know when the next meeting of Pride New Orleans will be? And I know the answer because we are not Pride New Orleans. We're just here having a conversation about what it used to be like. So we don't know. That's up to the community, right?
It is. And at present, the organization that's produced Pride for the last 9 years has been dissolved. There are a number of people out in the community working and meeting to restructure and start from scratch. I'm assuming, and I would hope, that there's going to be a community meeting at some point, but we're not even close to that yet, from what I understand. But whenever that is set, we'll let people know.
Mark?
We're getting some good comments from the people listening, and a couple of them are, in Baton Rouge, it's indoors, but maybe in New Orleans we could do something that's both indoors, outdoors. That's one of the things. And then we need to make sure that the board, whoever does take up the flag for Gay Pride, needs to make it very accessible to everybody, to the rest of the community. Don't just call a meeting and say you're the new board, but make it give people enough notice to get involved, so that, like Michael said earlier, you're community based and diverse.
Yeah, I just want to say that, if anybody's confused, we are not, this panel, we didn't bring it together like we're speaking for everybody. There's so many other voices that we haven't heard. We're not decision makers. Yeah. We're just having a conversation on Zoom because we can't gather with one another. I got a question. I'm going to throw it to Mark. It's from Wayne Phillips, who curated this wonderful History of Gay Carnival exhibit at the museum. Mark, Wayne asks, how much did the Anita Bryant rally in 1977 influence the founding of Fest?
I think it was in everybody's head. I mean, we saw the hate.
Who's Anita Bryant for people who don't know?
Well, I'm going to let Frank answer. He's much more authoritative on things, but she came to New Orleans and was really the face of hate against the gay community. Frank?
Anita Bryant was a homophobic popular singer, former beauty queen, who in the 70s got a gig as the spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Commission, which basically means she hawked orange juice. And in 1977, Miami-Dade County passed an ordinance protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination in the workplace. She thought that was bad. She led a campaign to successfully overturn that ordinance. And when that happened, she became the darling of the religious right. And then she started this national campaign to save our children. And she traveled the country for that. And about a month or so after the ordinance deal, it was announced that she was coming to New Orleans to perform a concert at the Municipal Auditorium.
Yes.
And a number of people, Alan Robinson, Bill Rushton, I want to say Ann Gallmeyer, but I'm not sure about that. Several other people got together and said, this is terrible. We need to form a protest. They formed a group called HERE, and they staged this massive protest in Jackson Square. They didn't know it was massive when they were planning it. They were hoping that maybe a couple hundred people would turn out, and it was actually closer to 3,000 or 4,000. You have to remember, this goes back to the original question. This is just 4 years after the Upstairs Lounge arson, which occurred in 1973. Unlike Stonewall, which resulted in tangible action, the fire here in New Orleans had just the opposite effect. It caused the gay community to retreat deeper into the closet, if anything. And although there were a few attempts at organizing, none of it was really sustained. It was all very short-lived. But by the time Anita Bryant came to town 4 years later in 77, the community was just ready for whatever reason. And so many historians would say that the Anita Bryant protest and march was the first significant, not first, but the first significant demonstration on behalf of gay rights in New Orleans. So it kind of set the stage.
You know, I happened to be a part of that movement. I was in that protest. I do remember the gay bars during that time not serving orange juice.
Right.
They all stopped buying orange juice, you know, as a form of protest, you know, that Anita Bryant was coming, and no bars would sell orange juice. I think that was some of her downfall. You know, these people are selling orange juice. You know, we drank lots of screwdrivers. So the bars in protest stopped selling orange juice products.
It's great. As we kind of wind down, the time flies when we were talking about this stuff. It's so fascinating to me, and I wish we could get to everybody's question, but what I'd like to hear from y'all is, and I know you've been doing this already, but if you had to just tell somebody, you know, a young person, a young LGBT person, what was it like then that you want them to know? What do you want younger people to understand about what y'all were doing at this time that they may not know? Anybody?
Would you do me a favor and repeat that question? Well, go ahead, Catherine, maybe I'll go back.
No, I'll repeat it for everybody. So if you were speaking to a younger person today about what it was like then, somebody who just has no idea what it was like, what would you tell them? Catherine?
I heard a comment about 5 years ago that speaks to this question for me. I was at an HRC sponsored Time to Thrive meeting. Anybody heard of Time to Thrive? HRC sponsors it with the American Counseling Association. It's for youngsters, gay, trans kids. And they're on there about 8th or 9th right now. And it's 2 days of that. And I was at one of the tables representing ACA, American Counseling Association, and two lovely people walked up to me and said, "We have to hug you." And I said, "Okay, you know, people come up, you're doing things, whatever." And they didn't know who I was. They certainly just knew I was representing something, and I was an older person. I was supporting them, and I had just done a program. And they were crying, and they said, they said, "We realize, most of us here realize what people like you all did for us. Some people don't, but most people realize how dangerous it was back then." And it isn't an accolade that I'm looking for, it's an acknowledgement that that kind of freedom that is now can go away. And now is the time to think about really getting closer, really inviting and playing with, so to speak, other people and getting it all together as one group, because it's tenuous. I always have felt that. My whole life I've felt that way as a lesbian. It's tenuous, what I've been able to do, what I haven't. And so that's what I like to tell a lot of people, you know, just that.
Valda, I think I saw your hand.
Yep. I think that I would say it's not over. I mean, just last week, our fearless leader said that health professionals can choose not to treat LGBT people. If they decide they don't want to treat us, they don't have to, which is something that they've been doing all along. But it's not over. It's nowhere near over. So, you know, you cannot take this for granted. It might seem easier, but you can have all the laws you want, but it's not going to change people's minds.
Mark?
Yeah, I would like people to understand that the panelists here we're all pretty happy, involved people. And so I would encourage people to understand that, you know what, you've got to take a little bit of a risk in life.
Yes.
And you're going to find out that it's more than well worth it to take the risk to get involved. I know it's so simple to just say get involved, but you know, so you're gonna actually have to do something a little bit different, and you're gonna get involved, and you're gonna find out that you're gonna meet other great people. You're gonna have a great time. It's not gonna be a waste of your time. But you know what? If you take the risk and you don't like it, so what? What have you lost?
Yeah.
Nothing. So I'd say get involved, and like get involved with the new Pride New Orleans. Get involved with Black Lives Matter. Get involved with police, whatever you want to call it, reform, defunding. But I really want people to get involved like we have been. And I think you'll find that everybody here is a very happy, successful, well-rounded person, and you will be too.
I just want to throw in there that, you know, when you say get involved with Pride New Orleans, I think now that things have sort of fractured, there's so many different organizations. Frank mentioned one, the Black Pride. You know, there's the People's Movement, the Marxist kind of movement for Pride. There's so many different things that people can get involved with. It's just kind of finding out what they are. Ron Julian wrote, speaking of ephemera, Frank, I've got some people are saying they've got some items. I just want to mention that, you know, the Archives Project is not itself an archive, but we can help you get connected with the right archive for your materials. Frank, you want to speak on that for a second?
Sure. Collecting this material is very important, and I would just invite anybody to email the Archives Project or me personally. I'll be happy to meet with you, look at what you have, talk to you about where it can go, and I would just encourage people that have material to reach out. And Jim, if I could go back and answer your question about what would you tell a young person, I would say educate yourself. Go on to Netflix, watch the Marsha P. Johnson documentary, read Clay Dellery's book and Bobby Fiesler's book on the Upstairs Lounge Fire and Johnny Townsend's book. Read Howard Smith's book on Gay Carnival. Read, learn, educate yourself. That's what I would tell young people.
And you got a book about decadence, Frank?
Yes, I've got a few books out there myself, but
And I
if we don't learn this stuff, it's going to go away.
Yeah, and I think one of the easiest ways to learn about the history of New Orleans, the gay community, is talking to people like me, talking to old people. We are happy to share our information. We're happy to sit down and talk to you and tell you where we've come from, and hopefully you'll take that information and use it, empower yourself, and take our community further.
Well, I'll myself and say that your generation, y'all are my heroes. You gave me you're the reason we're having this conversation, which I hate to bring to an end. But we've already been talking for an hour and a half. I just want to tell everybody who's been attending that we're going to send you links. We're going to get so you can see, just for the record, clips, some other courses, books. Anybody who's registered, you should look for an email. Look in your spam box because it might go to your spam, but we'll give you some resources. I don't see anybody jumping to say anything, so I think I'm going to close. I just want to thank all of you one more time for Valda. You wanted to say something? Oh, nope. I wanted to thank all of you for participating. Valda, Catherine.
I want to thank all of the people that have been submitting questions and listening, and this wouldn't have been happening but without you also participating.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Happy Pride, everybody. Be proud.
Pride.
Proud.
This report will be available soon on YouTube. So look for that. Y'all have a good night. Happy Pride.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.